While most of Nashville might be closed right now, the pharmacy is open for a special snow day edition of Pharmaceutical Soccer. Clay Trainham, joined by Valeria Shavilla. We were both warm. We were both inside. We were both in the southern part of Nashville, and we are getting ready for this hot preseason press conference news from Gary Smith as we get ready for another Nashville soccer season. I guess that's the best way to start here is like, that's the big news. Obviously, the preseason is underway. It feels like the season just ended mere days ago, and the team was reporting to the practice facility just a few days ago. They are now on their way or in Florida, actually. It doesn't really feel like it was much of an offseason, does it, Valer?
No, not really. I mean, just from our perspective, even if not the players' perspective, we had shows going. We took a few weeks break, but we're back at it because there are things happening, right? And that's what it feels like in this MLS schedule. It's a very, very congested schedule when we're in season, and when we're off season, it's very short and quick back to the action. The other thing about soccer is that there's always soccer going on. So if you like European soccer, or like international soccer, or you like any other kind of soccer, if you're a soccer fan, there's never off season really. So, but for the boys and girls specifically, they're back at it, and yeah, I'm curious. I'm curious if we're gonna start seeing the effects of that maybe earlier in the season, just because they didn't have a full break. Really, it feels like.
Well, yeah.
But actually, before we keep going, I have to say something really quickly.
Okay.
Happy birthday.
Oh, thank you.
As
Thank
I know
you.
it's late, but
Yeah,
there you go.
well, is what it is. We played a bunch of board games at the house and then got snowed in for a long weekend. So not the worst way to spend your birthday, I suppose. Uh, we'll get to your weekend shortly because that
Mm,
was intentional. So we don't act like
yeah.
I forgot to ask
Okay. Okay.
because I didn't. We're gonna get to it later. But before we do that, like we've talked about, the boys in gold are in Florida. They've gone to Florida every single year that the team has played. So this is year 7 starting preseason in Florida. And the preseason schedule is out there, and it's actually there's going to be a preseason game available to the public, which is a first in several years. And it just feels a little weird, but it's because Champions League starts so quickly that these preseason games need to come fast and furious.
Yeah, I was told by an NSC spokesperson that the first game at Georges Park against Birmingham Legion will be open to the public to some capacity. I don't know what limitation there's going to be. It's probably going to be pretty cheap, maybe even free. I don't know. This is me speculating. This is not what I was told. I was told, however, that it will be open not only to the media members but also to the public. Again, this is. I think this is a really cool thing from NSC to finally do. I think there's appetite for it out there. We've seen the comments, we've seen the replies. Folks really want to see preseason. It does seem like there won't be streaming any games down in Florida or the Geodis Park one. And obviously with the second Geodis Park game against Memphis 901, that's really close to the season kicking off for Nashville SC. It's, I think, exactly a week before. And there are some things that benefit Nashville SC for not showcasing that and making it readily available online in terms of tactics, of course, especially since the Mocha game, like I said, is a week after that. You're looking at a team that has added new pieces, that the manager, which we'll get to, has spoken about how they're going to play differently, and you can notice the differences. I don't blame them for not wanting to put that out there a week before they play their first game of the season against an opponent that they're very unfamiliar with.
Yeah, and before we get into that a little bit, just the preseason schedule, just to recap, it will begin on January 26th versus St. Louis City SC in Port St. Lucie, Florida. Then there are 2 games in West Palm Beach, Florida on January 30th and February 2nd against Sporting KC and Toronto FC, respectively. Then on February 7th, which is my father's birthday, will be against Birmingham Legion at Geodis Park before a February 15th game against Memphis 901 FC. Now, going back to not wanting to reveal too much, several years ago, even in the USL, Nashville was fairly tight-lipped on what they wanted to show and not show during preseason, even though fans were, for the most part, allowed to go to matches. I remember there was a game actually scheduled. There was going to be a game actually scheduled up in Evansville one preseason against St. Louis, but then St. Louis ended up being the opening game, and it changed the plans for what they wanted to do up there. So little things like that can affect the season, and Nashville has always kind of been pretty tight-lipped on that. They don't really like to let people see what's going on, which is kind of funny, and we're going to get into the Gary comments in the next segment, but it's kind of funny because it's not like Nashville's reinvented the wheel in the way that they've played. This is now going into year 7 with this front office, and large parts of this team have not had much change over year to year.
Yeah, I would say I would agree with that, but at the same time, Clay, like I think you can think of Gary what you want to think, whether folks like him or dislike him, his style, all that. One thing that I know for a fact that he doesn't get enough credit on is his ability, his flexibility in terms of tactics. I think there's this sort of impression, right? He's a defensive coach, all that, and then folks aren't actually watching a lot of the matches. I honestly think 2023, for better or worse, proved that Gary's very flexible with his tactics. We saw different formations, different systems, and we saw a different way of tackling the game. Now, here's the thing: Nashville ran out of ideas, whether that's Gary or the players, or we talked about that to death, right? We don't need to rehash that. But what I'm saying is that saying that Nashville will be the same in 2024, I just don't believe that, just simply because the fact is Gary did change his tactics in 2023 pretty heavily, then change back, then change them again. So he's not stubborn in terms of that. Now, he does have a way of carrying himself and carrying that team, and that is maybe a little more defensive than people would like. Yes, I would agree with that. But I do think he doesn't get enough credit in terms of how, I don't know if growth is the right word in terms of tactics, but at least how flexible he is in terms of those tactics.
Well, I mean, this is typically what's said of managers that know how to get results. And by results, obviously, there's an emphasis on draws there. I think that as an Everton fan, people certainly say that about Sean Dyche, but Sean Dyche doesn't play the same lineup, the same setup week to week. It really does depend on the opponent. And I think you could say the same of Gary Smith, but at the end of the day, people look at the results and they make certain inferences based off the worst version of that team, if that makes any sense. I think that happens a lot when the team's in bad form. You look at it and say, well, this is the way they play. But when the team's in good form, it's like they're playing that way despite or in spite of the managers playing that way with it, when in fact, that's kind of part and parcel to the way that they set up teams.
Yeah, and these perceptions, they come from something, right? I mean, I think folks are looking at Gary's most successful MLS season where he won the league in 2010 and making assumptions with that. Now, that was 14 years ago. You know what I mean? Like, things are different now.
They were the third highest scoring team in the league.
I think that right, but nobody's talking about it. Yeah, exactly. And it's the same thing with Nashville during Leagues Cup. Leagues Cup, Nashville scored a lot of goals. Nashville did not play with 5 at the back. Even the Miami game in the final, Nashville wasn't sort of defensive, but all that kind of went away just because the results went away in the second half of the season. You know what I mean? If those results had persisted, then Gary Smith would be in the conversation for manager of the year again, which, by the way, he kind of was in 2021. Because Nashville didn't lose a single game at home. So, again, I'm not here defending him or anything like that. I'm just saying the idea that he's a defensive coach, he just does the same thing over and over. So why are you kind of holding back on games for opponents to see? I just think that's just not how how sports work. And the other part of it is that I think it's an MLS problem more than a Nashville SC problem, really. But there isn't any sort of mandate to showcase preseason games. And most importantly, I don't think there's enough desire from fans, honestly. I mean, I think you have your diehard fans, which they are the ones in our replies and our comments saying, "Hey, we want to see preseason matches." But other than that, you don't really see that desire unless Messi is playing in your town and you move it to the biggest arena in your city. Anyway,
Well,
that's
well,
for a different day.
I do think it is funny. It's this ebb and flow, right? Like if we had access to every single preseason match, we would watch less preseason because
Yes. Yeah.
because back in the USL when we watched preseason, you and I remember that. I mean, there might be 30 minutes worth watching in a preseason match because they change over the rosters, they change over the lineups, aren't exactly predictive. They're playing guys who aren't going to play in the regular season. And if we were there for every game, we would probably care less. But now, since we can't see any of it, we're looking
Yeah.
for any bite at the apple to try and get a sense of what's going on. And we're going to get back to this conversation on Gary Smith and tactics because his press conference was over the weekend. And we will do that here in a little bit. But before we go to our first break of the show, I believe we've got some shout outs.
Yeah, we have one shout out for a new Patreon member. So shout out to Robert, maybe Robert Austin. I don't know if that's like a hyphenated name or not. Regardless, Robert, thank you so much for joining. This is very helpful for us to have a new Patreon member, and we've seen that community grow. And honestly, it means the world to us because it makes sure that this show continues to go on. Your support is amazing. I know the benefits we're giving you are not huge, but you get early access to the show. And anything else in the future, you'll have the first dibs on all that stuff. But most importantly, you are helping us continue this show. You're helping us. You're motivating us to continue this show for anything. And it's just $5 a month. That's all it costs you. And it means the world to us. So thank you, Robert. And you guys should be like Robert if you're listening to this.
This is the longest continuously operational Nashville show here. We've been around since the last year of USL, and that is important to us. And we like to keep it going. And the way that we can keep it going is with your support. So we appreciate it. We do not take it for granted. And we look forward to adding many more of you as the season goes on and as Nashville gets going with its 7th professional season. And with that said, we're going to cut it to break. We will be back to talk more about this Gary Smith press conference. We're going to talk a little bit about Hani Mukhtar and some comments. You're listening to Pharmaceutical Soccer. And welcome back to Pharmaceutical Soccer. Clay Trainum joined by Valer Shabila. Now, typically when we start a show, we ask Valer how his weekend went. It's been a bit that's been running for a while, but we actually know a little bit about how Valer's weekend went, aside from a birthday party we were both at. You also got to go to the first Gary Smith press conference of the year over the weekend, and I'm sure that played a big role in your plans as far as how the weekend unfolded.
Yeah, had a good, nice weekend. Played some card games. I learned the game of euchre, which if
Midwestern Classic.
It's crazy that Steven isn't here and we're discussing this game because he's told me about it for all 6 years that I've known him, and he never taught me. But or all 7 years I've known him. But I was able. Some very nice folks taught me how to play, and that was on Saturday night. We also went to a friend's birthday party, which was pretty cool to see everybody there. But yeah, Sunday morning, bright and early. Well, not really early, but bright at least. Went down to Antioch at the Vanderbilt. What's the official name? Vanderbilt Training Facility. Sure. And that's where National State Vanderbilt Health Training Facility. Yeah, thank you. That makes a lot more sense. Went down there and got to ask a good amount of questions to Gary Smith. There were a few of us media folks in there, and we were able to kind of have a little bit more extended time with Gary than you would have in a post-match situation. Stayed after the press conference for like an hour talking to some other folks. So there's a lot of cool things happening this season, y'all. So I'll leave it at that for now. But back to Gary. I think as I reflect on sort of covering this team, well, even before I was in these press conferences, I think Gary, I viewed him as always a guy who spoke his mind a lot of times. I don't think he really does a lot of the he he doesn't hide a lot. He tells you how he's thinking a lot of times, and I appreciate that. He's a guy who knows how to talk to the media, in all honesty, and I think that's good, but could be frustrating, I think, for fans as well. So I will leave it at that. And if anybody's listening to this and haven't listened to the full press conference or seen the full press conference, it's out there on Broadway Sports. You can read it or watch it, whatever it is. But I think 25 minutes or so of Gary getting questions from media back, for the whole thing is worth your time. And we learned a lot. I think for me personally, I learned a good amount just from that one press conference.
Well, I mean, we had John Freeman on this show during COVID, and he tells the story about a game against Penn FC in 2018. And the Penn FC coach had said something that seemed rather innocuous, but sort of belittled Gary's style of play. And then they just came out and blew the doors off of Penn FC the next game and made sure that they talked about it in the show. So he's pretty much on Front Street about what he thinks about any given thing. And as a media member, that's something that you can take. You at least know you're getting something, because a lot of times you just get very basic answers from a lot of managers. And I don't think people appreciate that about Gary enough, especially in a place where, Mike Vrabel isn't exactly opening any, or wasn't exactly opening any behind the scenes curtains whenever he was with the Titans. So let's get into those comments. I mean, the first thing to think about, the first thing that's on a lot of people's mind talking about this Nashville roster build is, of course, the loss of former team captain, Dax McCarty. A loss that we talked about on this show quite extensively last week and got a little bit of pushback on, I will say, as well as Fafa Pico.
Yeah, Gary mentioned both of those players and Luke Hawkinson by name. Believe it or not, those were the three players he mentioned when it was asked about players losing. Obviously, Dax took the sort of the most of his comments came from Dax. He actually unpromptedly talked about losing Dax in the very first question of the press conference. So before even he was asked about it, he brought it up. Obviously, team's first captain, and I think he's under no impression that losing him is gonna be a big deal. I think what he seems to be saying, or kind of you read between the lines, is that he's excited about the new signings just as much as he's sad to see the initial ones leave, the players they sold leave or whose contracts ran out. So I think he never downplayed Dax or anything like that. He acknowledged that Dax's loss and Fafa's loss, even within the locker room, not necessarily on the pitch, is going to be huge. But it's kind of that's the business. And one thing that kind of stuck out to me is that from the beginning of the press conference, pretty much till the end, Gary kept talking about evolution and evolving. And I wouldn't be surprised if losing Dax is part of that evolution, is part of evolving. Because as we've discussed, he's an older player, and maybe Nashville is moving forward in terms of the way they play and everything. That's not, again, to downplay what Dax did for this team, because I think he was big, important legend of the club. But sometimes it's time to move on, and maybe that's what Nashville and Gary were saying here.
Yeah, and I think that's a important thing to think about. I mean, typically in MLS, you don't see coaches last as long as Gary Smith has. There's very few that have a tenure that's particularly long. I mean, I know that you mentioned in the press conference that this is the longest he's been at any club, but I mean, just looking at it big picture, it's like Peter Vermees and SKC, and you got oh God, I just totally spaced on anyway.
Who are you thinking about?
Seattle.
Oh, yes, Pete Carroll. No, I'm just kidding.
Schmetzer.
Brian
Sorry,
Schmetzer,
but,
yes.
But you think about these guys that were around for a long time, and one of the things that's most important if you're going to hold a managerial job in MLS is turning the roster over. Like you have to see a change in the roster, which results in a change in the way you play. And Nashville is kind of in the second or third iteration, depending on the way you look at it, under Gary Smith. They had to build a roster. Then they had a pretty big changeover from year one to year two in USL. And then an even bigger one from the last year in USL to the first year at MLS. And then kind of as time's gone on, been a changeover to this most recent iteration. Now this feels like the first true full transition within MLS. Obviously, Hani Mukhtar is still there, but you've got some guys that are getting towards the end, and Dax might just be the first one through the doors and what's going to be a lot of people leaving in the next couple of years. And Gary Smith has to find a way to navigate that. And this is kind of Dax is the first one to kind of, all right, he's gone now. What's going to replace him? And down the line, you're going to be talking about Joe Willis, about Walker Zimmerman, probably about Hani Mukhtar at a certain point. Like as the roster changes over, that's where you have to start to figure out. And if Gary is the guy, this is kind of part of the process. And it's hard to like feel it that way as a fan, but things change pretty quickly in MLS because guys are either later on in their careers or they just kind of hit the ceiling.
Yeah, and it's getting the right time, right? You either move on from a player at the right time or you stick with them a little too long. And sometimes some players are just worth you stick with them too long until they retire at your club, right? So it's finding the right time. And maybe this is a little bit out of Gary's control as well. This is more Mike Jacobs' cup of tea here, but finding the right value at the right time. You look at a player like Dave Romney, for example. Dave Romney was a fan favorite, incredible, stellar of a player. But that opportunity for Nashville to trade him for that much money will never come for Dave Romney again. So you ask yourself the question, can Nashville be better without Dave Romney and get that much money? And if the answer is yes, then you let go of them, right? So it's finding the right time.
And a perfect example of that move working too. Like Dave Romney moved on, and obviously it took a little bit for someone behind Jack to kind of find it, but Nashville now still has the best or one of the best center back groupings in the entire league from 1 to 4. Like it's
and
pretty
I don't
good.
think you can say even with everything the way it unfolded, even with Nick DePuy's injury and everything, I don't think you can say that Dave Romney trade was not a net positive for Nashville.
Absolutely,
you know what I mean?
Absolutely.
So that's an example of it working, right? There are examples of it not working. Maybe you stick with someone too long, or you're giving someone a little bit more of a leash. Now, sometimes they come through, but you look at somebody like Randall Leal, who's been renewed with Nashville SC, who hasn't really hit those performances, maybe not because of an effort issue, just simply because he's injured a lot of times. You know, that's out of anybody's control. But at the end of the day, you did make the decision to keep him in your roster, right? So you're paying him $1 million to pretty much be injured for most of the year. I'm not saying that didn't work. Randall Leal could come back and have an amazing 2024. I'm just saying it's not always the right decision to sell early. Sometimes the right decision is to keep as well.
We're entering a third straight Nashville season asking if Randall Leal is going to make the next step.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, that
you don't want that from one of your star players. That's
right.
Essentially it, right?
Yeah, and then kind of like we've been focusing a lot on former players, on like people leaving. Like there was a lot of things to like from what Gary said about new guys coming into the fold. Obviously, Boyd and Yearwood were talked about explicitly, but it feels like there's a lot of energy there.
Yeah, he seemed honestly. I was a little maybe not surprised, but it caught me a little bit off guard how excited he was about Boyd. He went on to praise him for like a solid like couple minutes, maybe 5 minutes of just praising Boyd and the way what he brings to the team. Now, obviously, he hasn't spent much time with these players. He did, say hi to them pretty much, and maybe saw them run indoors because they didn't even go outdoor because it's so cold. So, I think a lot of it is just coming from seeing his games with the Galaxy. I do think he's excited. One thing Gary mentioned is that not only is he a dynamic winger, which is obviously a great quality, but he gives you a little bit more because he described him as, don't quote me here, but like a complete player or a good footballer, something like that. So he's very excited about him. He did mention Drew Yearwood physically fills in all the gaps they had last season. He said he kind of He's everything we were looking for in terms of physical qualities. So that's very important for a midfielder. And he did mention Mackenzie Gaines as well by name a few times throughout the press conference. So you have, you have these three additions. Obviously, there were some other additions, but I don't think they grant a mention yet. But I think in terms of Yearwood and Boyd, um, I would just simply from the way he reacted to those questions, I would say Gary was a big fan of bringing them to the club.
I think you're almost underselling it. I've got his answer to Boyd pulled up right here, and I think it's worth reading.
Yeah, go
He
ahead.
said, he's not just a dynamic wide player who's capable of scoring and creating goals, which, by the way, on its own is a nice quality to add, but he's a good football player. He's got a good appreciation of the game. We bring him into our group in a period of his life and his career. I think we get him at his best. 28, 29-year-old prime of his career. I think we're finding a player here that possesses all the qualities that we need and needed to add to complement our group. I mean,
Yeah.
that's he's selling them pretty hard there, and he goes on for another couple of minutes after that, but that's about as high praise that you're going to get from Gary Smith basically about anybody that's not named Hani Mukhtar.
Yeah, and I think this kind of puts the pressure on Boyd, not in a bad way, but he's a player who's been around, and Gary even mentioned playing in Europe and coming back and playing at the Galaxy, but he's a player who I would say throughout his career he's had pressure on him. He's had pressure on him to perform, and maybe Gary's seeing that and saying, you know what, I will praise him. I will go out of my way to say how great he is of a player, and that should motivate a player like Boyd, right? He's not a Jack Merrick coming out of a draft. You know what I mean? This is a player who's been with the national team, who's been with these big clubs, and he's had to deal with pressure. And maybe that's when we see high competitors, that is one of their main qualities, is that they enjoy that pressure and they want to thrive within that pressure. So I think that was maybe a little targeted by Gary and maybe a little intentional to speak about him in that way.
Yeah, I mean, and obviously a guy coming in, you want him to immediately feel like a leader up there as well. And we kind of already talked about the tactical changes, but Gary Smith essentially said he's not doing his job if you don't notice how the team plays differently, which is putting a lot on himself.
Yeah.
And I don't really know how to take that, honestly, because we talked about the fact that he has been willing to change. But I think it's interesting that he put his neck out there like that. I think people's expectations for this team this year are lower than they have been since the first year.
That's fair. That's fair. I was pretty surprised actually at the way he handled that part of the press conference. Um, yeah, he mentioned it multiple times actually how there will be differences in 2024, and he one thing he kept talking about was the reflection he had kind of in the offseason between 2023 and 2024. He did say he's not gonna change the entire team's identity or anything like that, because if you do that, you probably lose the locker room immediately. But he is putting his neck out there, like you said, Clay, in terms of tactical, maybe some subtle changes, but they're not settled because he keeps saying that they are going to be noticeable on the very first preseason game, which no one will see, obviously, but maybe he'll see and tell us. But he's promising these things. So I think it's a big statement out there for Gary. And you know what? If I learned anything from National SC fans, they're going to remind him of that throughout the season. So if he comes out and it's the same thing, I think there's going to be some backlash, and maybe that's deserved because he is kind of putting a lot of pressure on himself, kind of like Tyler Boyd. I was talking about him putting pressure on Tyler Boyd. He's putting pressure on himself, and if he thrives on that pressure, then I think he'll get the praise he needs. But if he falls, then I think that would kind of set the tone a little bit for the remaining of 2024.
And then the last but not least to the Gary press conference, and we're going to talk about Hani just a little bit, was, I think you characterized he's going into the year acting like this is his team, but he did not say there wouldn't be any additions, although I think people kind of misunderstood what he was saying.
Yeah, I think my quote, the quote I had might have been a little might have been a little misleading in text, not on purpose. I was just kind of trying to type it as fast as I could. But I think for him, what he was saying is a very, very managerial answer when it comes to that. And it was just, yes, there might be new additions. And I think he kept repeating that they are looking for new additions. His comment about whether or not if a new addition would result in somebody departing the club, I think people misunderstood that part as well, because look, we saw that if a good offer comes in, Nashville is willing to part ways with somebody. If somebody comes in right now and offers Nashville a good amount for Alex Muyl, they will go and take that and turn it into a different player to come in, just like Dave Romney. Now, Alex Muyl is an important player for this Nashville SC team. Whether or not you like him, that's besides the point. He is an important player. I'm just saying, someone exiting doesn't always mean, it's Hani Mukhtar being sold to Europe. Like it's not that. It could be Brian Anunga. It could be whoever it is can leave and you upgrade on that position, or upgrade in a different position if you have a lot of players in a certain position. So I just think people maybe read a little too much into that quote about somebody leaving for someone to come in. And I think what he was talking about was major signings. I think we're going to see a lot of signings that will go straight to Huntsville. I think we're going to see signings that are signed to Huntsville to start with. But I think for major signings, it's very rare that you'll see a team at this level, at where Nashville is right now, bring in someone major without losing someone to a similar status, or maybe even like a lower status.
Yeah. Last but not least, as far as press conference quotes go, we have to get this one out there. It kind of made the rounds the other day, last Thursday, from Hani Mukhtar at MLS's league-wide media day. It's not something he hasn't particularly said before, but his quote was, and I'm going to start with it here. This was transcribed by Ben, who's, Ben Wright, Valaire's current coworker at Broadway. And that is, quote, to achieve the next level, it's important for us to dominate the game with the ball. We have to do the next steps for our future with the club. We just saw it with Columbus Crew. They won MLS Cup, and they're one of the best teams with the ball. Now, I think more people have understood what he was trying to say, but initially I saw people talking about like this means that Nashville has to, dominate possession or hold possession or things like that. And I think to me it seems fairly clear he's talking about just being less wasteful in possession, which is something that everyone could see that Nashville was repeatedly. When Nashville's playing bad, they have a lot of the ball and they don't score.
Yeah, it's honestly, possession could be freaking 20%. If Nashville wins and do something with that 20%, Hani will be happy and fans will be happy. And that's the truth here. The truth is you don't need to have a whole lot of possession to force your way into a game. And that's been proven not only in MLS, all over the world. It's not having the ball is what you do with the ball, which is what I think Hani's 100% talking about and has talked about.
Yeah, Hani is one of the most lethal players in the entire league with the ball at his feet going full speed at the goal. He wasn't down the stretch at the end of last season, which was a problem, but that is his game. And when he is successful in MLS, he's not sitting there and it's not a 20-pass sequence. It's a 3-4 pass sequence. Hani's on the attack, entering the 18 with the ball at his feet. So Hani definitely would prefer more of those situations, which you don't necessarily get out of possession. So I just wanted to clarify that a little bit because I saw that quote start to make the rounds over the weekend.
Yeah, and I think you will need to adapt and learn, because once the teams playing Nashville SC just knew that giving Nashville the ball would result in 0 goals for Nashville more often than not, they started just giving them the ball. Hey, figure it out. Go do your thing. We'll take a draw at Geodis Park. We're fine with that. And then, maybe score a penalty at the very end. Who knows? But, I think that's the part, that's the onus on Gary Smith and the players to figure out that part, which is what I think Hani is talking about, which is, I think, a very, very fair criticism, or maybe self-reflection even, more so than criticism, is to figure out how to be better on the ball. And we both argued this point on Twitter, Clay, that Tyler Boyd, Andrew Yearwood help with that. So they have found the problem. They seem to have made the right moves for that problem. And I think Hani's comments are very fair. I just don't want folks to look at possession numbers and act like that's the be all of what Hani's talking about, because it's not. And possession is an important, valuable data point. That doesn't mean it's the data point to look at whether a team is dominant or controlling the game.
And I think that's kind of a good place to leave it. We're going to have a whole lot more to talk about what this Nashville team is going to look like going forward. We're going to have even some data points over the next few weeks as preseason will get started. And yeah, we're right in it. We're right in it. This time, a month from now, we'll probably be doing the annual prop bet show. That's how close we are to the start of the season. So we're going to get back. We're going to talk a little bit about what's going on in the international scene. Valera is very excited about a particular team on the other side of the world. And we'll be back with more on Pharmaceutical Soccer. And welcome back to Pharmaceutical Soccer, the last segment. We're not going to talk hardly anything about Nashville SC for these next few minutes. But it's sort of an international window right now. And you've got Camp Cupcake going on for the national team, the U.S. national team, which is, the guys who aren't playing in Europe essentially in camp. And then you have both the African Cup of Nations and the Asia Cup going on right now. We know which cup is most important to Valer Shabila, as it plays a pivotal role in his life as a soccer fan. And so I'm going to let you take it away.
Yeah, I would. So the Asian Cup is the one Clay's talking about, or Asia Cup, or Asian Championship, whatever you're going to call it. It's the continental competition in Asia for all the Asian teams to compete in, like the Gold Cup or the Euros or Copa America. So in 2007, Iraq, the country I am from, the country I grew up in, won the Asian Cup. Now, you're probably thinking, is that normal? Does that happen? No, it doesn't happen. There are a few reasons why that doesn't happen. The first reason is that, well, there was a civil war in the country. So that
was Iraq a different place in 2007?
It was pretty different from now. Currently, it's not the safest place in the world, but it's much safer. It's less deadly to go there. And not only that, 4 years before that, I think the invasion of Iraq from America and 30 odd countries, where they all decided to invade Iraq, that happened in 2003, 2007 Civil War, plus Iraqi national team wins Asian Cup. Now, I'm putting these three events in the same category because they were, for us as Iraqi people who lived in Iraq. This national team in 2007 helped us as a country heal a little bit, and there are books, there are videos about it. I highly recommend you look it up. I can do probably a 4-episode series on it, so I'm not going to do that right now in this episode, but I just want to raise awareness to it because I think what happened there, I was in Baghdad when in 2007 as a kid, and got to experience a couple days of pure celebrations just because 11 guys kicked the ball really well, and that was probably the only celebrations that have stuck with me from that period of my life as a kid in Baghdad. So it's a really, really cool story, a really amazing story, and a story that made me believe that it's more than a game, and made me believe that sports, and more specifically soccer, is such a powerful tool, because literally a couple days before the final, it was just death and and bombings and stuff like that, and then that changes into celebrations within a few days simply because of this game. So it's a very big deal. Iraq is not the only country who's had a situation like that. Ivory Coast, look at Drogba. Even though I dislike him for being a Chelsea player, he has done a lot of good in the Ivory Coast. Yeah.
Well, I mean, it's easy because Blair and I are both fans of soccer in England. I'm not going to say I'm a fan of the Premier League because read a headline, but it's easy for people that are fans of teams in Europe and the US to forget how important these competitions are, because they do interrupt your club season. And so it's easy to be like, I don't like the African Cup of Nations because two best players on my team aren't going to be around
Mhm.
and the team's not going to be able to. But like within those countries, they are very important. Egypt, African Cup of Nations, very important in Egypt. I mean, you can ask Mo Salah about that, especially with things that have happened there. Obviously, Valère referenced Drogba, literally ended a civil war. I mean, it patched up again a little bit, but ended a civil war when they qualified for the World Cup, playing in the African qualifiers. Like these things are very important. Valera's talked about the 2007 Asian Cup to me no less than a dozen times in the several years that I've known him. So like these are very important competitions, and they are going on around the world. And we don't know the backstories. We don't know what's going on with these individual countries necessarily, but they are important, even if they don't always feel that way. And I think part of the reason they don't feel that way to us is because Gold Cup doesn't feel that way over here, because it's a two-team tournament that's basically play. I mean, it's essentially a two-team tournament. It's mostly been U.S. and Mexico aside from 1 or 2 years, and uh, it happens every 2 years. Whereas other places in the world, these are very, very important, even if they happen during the club season calendar.
Yeah, yeah, and I think just to bring it back maybe to the current edition. Now if you have Paramount Plus, you can watch the Asian Cup. That's pretty cool. Um, it goes on early in the morning into the afternoon, and then AFCON is also starts later in the morning and goes into the afternoon. So now that we have the internet, that the soccer community around the world is what it is, you can maybe look at those, not necessarily just the games, but the storylines, right? And there was a really good story written in the Athletic, and I can't remember the reporter's name, so I'm sorry about that. But it was about the Eritrean national team and how those players feel. There are some players who escaped Eritrea through the national team and are still afraid to say where they are. So that's a whole different level, right? Become a refugee out of your national team when they went and played a game in South Africa or something like that. So there are those stories all around us, that are soccer related, but aren't necessarily about what's being done in the pitch or what's being played, which kind of maybe puts everything into perspective. Anyway, Iraq started their journey by winning 3-1 against Indonesia on Monday morning, and I was a very happy camper to see that happen. I was there are some really young talents coming out of Iraq that I'm very, very excited about. And we have a really nice Spanish manager who has been instilling this like style of play that's really exciting. So yeah, if you want to follow through and watch some Iraq games, they're all at 5:30, the next two. So but the next one is on Friday, 5:30 against Japan. And it's going to be a really, really big game for Iraq, because if we can get anything out of that, then we immediately become title contenders, right? But chances are Japan's going to win 4-0. But, we're going to keep a positive mind. And then AFCON, same thing. There were some really cool stories coming out of Monday, I want to say, or maybe Sunday. Egypt tied with Mozambique. That's a big, big result for Mozambique. Capo Verde beat Ghana. That's a huge, huge, huge result. There were a couple more out there. Nigeria tied as well with Guinea, I want to say, maybe. So there are results out there that kind of make you want to follow through these competitions, especially now since MLS season is not around. If you feel inclined, you can go watch those.
All right. And just to wrap it up with the U.S. Camp Cupcake going on, the match will be U.S. versus Slovenia on Saturday, January 20th. Nashville does have a player playing in that match. It will be, Shaq Moore, of course. And they will be playing at Toyota Stadium in San Antonio, which I do not believe. It's certainly been a long time since they've played in San Antonio, but I do not believe they've played in San Antonio. I'll have to check in my U.S. media guide about that. I personally don't really care about these matches, so I'm not even sure that I will be watching, but it's a chance for a lot of MLS guys to get minutes and maybe push themselves into contention for making a Gold Cup roster or things down the line. It is a very natural progression. If you can get in Camp Cupcake, find your way into the Gold Cup. If you can find your way in the Gold Cup, you can find your way into qualifiers in Nations League. And that is the route to make it from. A lot of times, if you're going to make it from a domestic league, that's the route you're going to end up having to go. It's a little bit more arduous and requires a lot more work, but it can happen, and there have been success stories from that.
Yeah, and look, things change in soccer really quickly. I think that's one thing you can count on. One injury here, one suspension here, and all of a sudden you see yourself called up, right? I don't think many people assumed Shaq Moore was going to have any World Cup minutes, and he played in 2 different games. So,
Walker Zimmerman went from a guy that was kind of, he's in the mix to a locked-on starter. I mean, he had a mistake in the World Cup, but I mean, just generally a locked-on starter for the U.S., and that's through kind of, grafting through the different, competitions that the U.S. can play in.
And most importantly for those players is that they don't have to deal with all the snow. So shout out to Shaq Moore.
Yeah. All right. Well, with that being said, we're going to go ahead and call it a wrap on this week's Pharmaceutical Soccer. Before we go, I'm going to send it to Valer. You got anything you want to plug?
Yeah. At Valer Shabilla on Twitter, Instagram, Threads, and Blue Sky. Mainly Twitter and Instagram, though. Stick with those. X, maybe. Is that our picture together, Clay?
I just noticed that it's a picture with us and Hani before when he got signed. And sorry, I'm just interrupting everything.
It's okay. I just, I saw my beautiful face and I was distracted.
Back when you had hair.
Well, arguably. An arguable amount of hair. But at Valer Shabilla again, we're cooking up some cool things in 2024. Let me just tell you that. I did a little recap for what I did in 2023, and I heard a lot of positive feedback from you all. And I really appreciate this. I don't take this for granted, even though it's not the best paying job, to say the least. I do this on the side. Of course, we all have full-time jobs that we have to do in order to survive, but these are the jobs we choose to do because we like them, right? So next time you see your local soccer reporter or podcaster, maybe give them a hug or a beer or something. Well, if they're Clay, don't give them a beer. So that's my first plug. My second plug is Kicking It 615. If you don't know about us, please go to ki615.org or at Kicking It 615 on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. We help kids who can't afford soccer play soccer for free. We also have a lot of exciting things. Even though I am not going to be as involved, I am still the founder and will be on the board of this organization. So I say not as involved. That doesn't mean I'm, not going to be around. But yeah, please help us out. We need all the help we can get Kicking It 615. And the last thing I'll plug is Nashville Soccer Archives, because a friend of mine does some great work there. Clay, I'll let you continue with that.
Yeah, shout out to Nashville Soccer Archive, the only place that is currently working and preserving the history of the game in Nashville. And now working with a partner in Vanderbilt University. More to come on that front. And you can follow me at Clay Lasol on Twitter and Instagram if you want, but Instagram will not be a whole lot. I'm not an Instagram power user, as friend of the show Tim Sullivan says. Yeah, so check out Clay Lasol and check out Pharma Soccer. You should follow Pharma Soccer on everything. And then after you follow us on everything, you should go ahead and become a Patreon member, and maybe we'll do some fun stuff on that front. As we get ready for another Nashville soccer season, we will see you next week. Thanks for listening to Pharma Soccer.